Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Audible provides its members with a great service that I highly recommend. It's also one of the best ways to make huge savings on Warhammer audiobooks. My new format audiobook club continues this month, and this time it is a short story, but one which is significant in the lore. I would say even unmissable. It is a hidden gem. And the short story I've chosen is First Lord of the Imperium, a 30-minute conversation featuring Malcador the Sigillite. And you can find out why my selection is unmissable at the end of this video. As an Audible member, you'll get 1 credit every month for any title across their entire premium selection, and as my choice this month is a short story at only 30 minutes in length, I recommend people consider purchasing this selection so as to not waste the full value of an Audible credit. Premium members get a 30% discount on purchasing audiobooks like this title, so this will run you roughly the price of a cup of coffee. So start listening with a free 30-day Audible trial and get access to thousands and thousands of audiobooks, originals and podcasts included in the Plus catalogue. Visit audible.com/Lutin or text Lutin to 500 500 for those of you in the US. Full details will follow at the end of this video. Within the darkness of the galaxy in the 41st millennium, humanity faces threats in all directions. Some are full frontal assaults on its territory and dignity, others are creeping and insidious that threaten to corrupt and devour humankind from within. The most dangerous threats to humanity do both, and these are by far the most critical of threats to mankind. Of the enemies facing the Imperium, the arguably most severe are that of chaos and the horrors which corrupt from the Immaterium and its fallen traitors. But following soon behind are the most nightmarish-inducing forms of the Tyranid Xenos. Both of these enemies will assault the worlds of the Imperium in straight assault and insidious deception. While the Tyranids appear to have a well-established playbook first identified by one Inquisitor Cryptman, where they first will envelop entire systems within their psychic static, now termed the Shadow in the Warp, this prevents any ships escaping or entering a region, as navigators and astropaths find the warp disturbances created by this effect too severe to communicate or travel through. Any worlds within this all-enveloping shadow of the Tyranids are then left to be consumed by a systematic and highly efficient process of bioconsumption. The Tyranids consume all and waste nothing. They are, for want of a better verb, the perfect organism. When an Imperial vessel eventually breaches the Mandeville point of a world and enters back into real space, their communications will be dead, and they will soon discover that the planet they were on course to is now nothing more than a barren, scarred husk. Very likely the planet will no longer even contain an atmosphere and will be redesignated as a dead Imperial world. It was roughly around 997 M41 when the Imperium began to lose contact with several systems in the Segmentum Tempestus. This is when Inquisitor Cryptman began the so-called Cryptman Census. Having any significant sense of the status of worlds across the Imperium is difficult at the best of times, with both the challenges of time difference and reliable communications, but the ongoing loss of contact was becoming troubling. Cryptman eventually made contact with every documented planet on the southern galactic region of the Imperium. What he found was a new Tyranid assault of terrifying scale. This new fleet was designated as Leviathan, and it appeared to be assaulting not across but through the galactic plane in a layman's perspective. They were attacking essentially from below, thus they would encapsulate a massive area across the Ultima Segmentum, which would additionally reach out into both Segmentum Tempestus and Solar. This Hive Fleet Leviathan was discovered to have formed 2 giant so-called tendrils, which are basically huge fleets of Tyranid that were situated many hundreds of light years apart. The effect of this was that it stretched the Tyranid's shadow in the warp over an absolutely massive area, and thereby disrupting, if not preventing, any and all psychic contact between the trapped worlds. Cryptman postulated that for any of the worlds trapped between these 2 essential jaws without severe action would inevitably be consumed and destroyed. It was thought initially that the only way a Tyranid invasion of a system could be halted would be to create a planetary firebreak by exterminating the biomass of entire worlds as they became enveloped at the first stages of assault from a Tyranid fleet, thereby making it inefficient for the Tyranids to continue on course, greatly slowing them or allowing them to become more reasonably engaged via traditional combat. This method was first employed on a truly apocalyptic scale by Inquisitor Cryptman that would make him infamous, when he ordered a cordon across a huge region of space, and within this, any world that began to become engaged by the Tyranids would immediately suffer exterminatus through the use of virus bombs, destroying all life on the planet. This caused the Tyranid fleets to lose vast quantities of their biomass upon each world they assaulted. The only downside, billions of human lives were extinguished as Cryptman believed it necessary to not evacuate these worlds for the greater good, pun intended. The larger benefit and arguable success of Cryptman's actions remain as an extremely controversial and debated topic within the Inquisition and upper echelons of the Imperium. It remains one of the most costly and widespread actions of planetary slaughter the Imperium has faced since the heresy, and Cryptman was left ridiculed by the Inquisition for his extreme measures, his title stripped. Essentially, he was left marked for execution. His extreme solution, though, did, however, slow the Tyranid fleet of Leviathan to a pace which could be better managed by the Imperials, and so, to his mind, the operation was a success. However, the threat of the Tyranid tendrils and their apparent course toward Terra itself remained. And regardless, the Inquisition and the wider Imperium felt that the cost he had deemed necessary was absolutely unacceptable and unjustified. This again continues to be debated. Inquisitor Cryptman had learned much of the nature of the Tyranids at this point in time, one of those being the bioform known as the Genestealer. These were in fact the first bioform encountered by the Imperium, but in these early times it was not known they were associated with the wider Xenos known as the Tyranid, which was still to be discovered. So it was assumed they were merely a native species of the planet known as Ngal, and it would only become clear later with the Tyranids assaulting the Ultramarines' world of Macragge that the connection to the Tyranids was confirmed. Despite his marked status, Cryptman still sought to halt the advance of the Leviathan, and he had learned of the Genestealers' nature, observing an ongoing conflict between the Orcs and Tyranid on the Imperial world of Tesla Prime. This was a weapons research planet and had been evacuated ahead of High Fleet Leviathan, along with a lot of the facility's equipment and research. Still, because of all the good loot remaining on Tesla Prime, many Orcs began to arrive soon after, apparently having become aware of this fact, and it is reported that the scale of explosions from Orcs' experimentation were so massive they were observed easily from space. It was not long after when Leviathan finally arrived, and the Orcs had been experimenting and constructing many horrific weapons and would have undoubtedly been ready to unleash a devastating warg on other Imperial worlds. Instead, they became tied up with the Tyranids, who began their assault upon Tessa, and this greatly slowed their advance, allowing the Imperium time to evacuate and fortify other nearby worlds. Essentially, both the Xenos became locked in a tug of war. It was very well demonstrated that the Orcs could hold their own against the Tyranids, and being both able to spawn quickly enough, fight aggressively enough, it created a close enough stalemate situation. The Tyranids also were able to recover continual biomass from the Orcs, and both entered into a downward spiral of attrition warfare. Of course, eventually it seems likely that the Tyranids would prevail, but Inquisitor Cryptman saw the potential for these two enemies to become locked with each other in a bloody war of attrition, potentially, in his mind, killing two birds with one stone. The only question was how to achieve this. And so Cryptman and an Astartes Deathwatch team, who had remained loyal to him, began a mission on the world of Carpathia to capture a brood of live Genestealers. This came at the cost of many Deathwatch lives, and the Genestealers though were acquired and secured in stasis fields. The next phase of the plan was especially cunning on the part of Inquisitor Cryptman, for the Genestealers would be unleashed upon a nearby Space Hulk which had appeared in real space, and by destroying a nearby moon, the Hulk was propelled toward the Orc Empire within the Octarius sector, which I should note is no small area. In fact, it's about as large as Ultramar. As the Space Hulk entered the Octarius Empire, it was boarded by Orc looters, of course, who were infected in a very short order by the Genestealers. This infection began to spread within the large Orc Empire in Octarius. and Cryptman understood that the Genestealers were essentially a pathfinder unit for the Tyranids. They would arrive on planets from a more conventional perspective behind enemy lines, and then begin a process of establishing a Tyranid presence on a world, preparing for when the main fleet would arrive to assault, softening up and acquiring genetic recon for the Tyranids, so that when they eventually arrived, this information could aid the Tyranid assault. It's an amazing and terrifying window into how advanced the Tyranids are, that they have the capability and evolved nature to carry out such infiltration objectives. So as a result of the Genestealer presence in the Octarius Empire, their psychic beacons, or signature, caused a major tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan to change their established course and now head toward the Orc Empire. Most importantly, away from Imperial space. This mission, carried out by Inquisitor Cryptman and the Death Watch, was so effective that even now, in the current time, Leviathan is still engaged in a bitter war of attrition with the Orcs, trapping them in an endless cycle of war and consumption. Cryptman, however, is not necessarily a genius, hence why he was reprimanded in the first place by the Inquisition for taking actions that were both rash and potentially more problematic down the line. Through his actions, there is now a severe danger that whichever Xenos emerges as the victor from the Octarius War could be an even greater threat to the Imperium. For what seemed like a good idea at the time, has now become seen to be a huge problem in the future for the Imperium. For if the Orcs are able to emerge victorious, but are significantly weakened by this conflict, worn down by the constant assault, then the odds could be good for the Imperium to launch a well-planned massive assault using both the Astartes and Militarum in a campaign to crush what remains, thereby reclaiming this sector for the Imperium. However, if the Orcs emerge bolstered by their victory over the Tyranids, if they're prepared to repel the borders of their empire, and more worryingly, if we are left with an entire sector of Orcs now grizzled with veteran combat experience and many bosses leading huge clans, all coordinated by a powerful war boss to launch a new apocalyptic warg, it could spell disaster, perhaps even leading to the loss of an entire Imperial galactic region. The middle scenario is both sides remaining locked in an ongoing conflict, and it can simply be managed and contained. There is also a worst middle scenario, which is the conflict grows and begins to spill out, dragging other nearby systems and worlds in. In fact, this is already happening, not to mention that others have begun to become involved, with both the Eldar and the Chaos World Eaters throwing themselves in the mix. So there is a danger for things to escalate and this conflict to grow. For the Eldar's involvement, they have apparently seen just how stupid this situation is, and that humanity had not considered the long-term repercussions that could be caused, as they often note to be the case within humanity. And so the Eldari are now burning Imperial and Orc worlds in an attempt to starve and diminish the Tyranids. The World Eaters, though, are enjoying the Festival of Blood and are gathering skulls for the Blood God. And I should note, it's important to remember that Khorne's worship does not require necessarily human souls nor temples or offerings to appease it. To worship it, this occurs on the battlefield. It is achieved purely through bloodshed of any species, and most importantly, it can come from victory or one's own suffering. It is very much about the actions, and allowing a single day to pass without engaging in bloodshed is said to incur Khorne's displeasure. And so the World Eaters here, found in the Octarius sector, a perfect crucible of slaughter. The last and obvious worst case scenario that Cryptman really should have considered in the long term is that should the Tyranids emerge victorious from this conflict with the Orcs, they will have had a vast pool of biomass to consume, and if this scenario should occur, the consequences are nearly unimaginable in how destructive they could be. It would not be saying too much to suggest that it could potentially spell the end of the Imperium, if not just within the Ultima Segmentum, that is the entire Eastern Galactic region and the largest region designated by the Imperium, but potentially the entire galaxy. The threat of chaos with the likes of Abaddon and the ever-awakening Necron cannot be underestimated in the modern era of the Imperium, and Lord Primarch Guilliman is engaged in these troubles even now, as are the Sororitas with their excursions into the Pariah Nexus. But it must be remembered that across the entire galaxy there exist ongoing wars such as the Octarius War, which are still active, still extremely dangerous to the stability of the Imperium, and carry the potential for, yes I will say it, catastrophic consequences. The Genestealer is one of the most insidious forms, even among Tyranid bioforms. For whilst the Tyranids have hundreds, if not likely thousands, even millions of bioforms within their fleets, If you factor in those at a bacteria and cellular level, only a few of those would be classified as the larger complex bioforms that we recognize as the Tyranid species, these physical, walking entities. Many of their common forms are now well known to the Imperium, creatures like the Tyranid warrior, the Carnifex, the Ripper, the Termagant. Yet nearly all of these Tyranid bioforms will be contained within their living ships that form hive fleets, as they are primarily used for planetary invasion to enable the vast consumption of biomass. Genestealers are physically similar to many other Tyranid forms. They're recorded as generally having 6 limbs, which is typical for this Xenos, large bulbous heads, ridged, hardened carapace, and their bodies are weighted to balance and move as a bipedal form. But they can move at significant speed even when using additional limbs for stability or climbing. And these upper limbs take the form of serrated razor-sharp talons, and the composition of these make their claws able somehow to be capable of slicing through even Astartes tactical dreadnought or Terminator armor. Their secondary limbs are typically shaped like gnarled hands, allowing the Genestealers to manipulate objects, climb, and even operate simple devices such as touch panels. As well as being highly dexterous, these secondary limbs are more than capable of ripping a limb from its socket or tearing open light armor. The Genestealer's thick muscled tail is largely vestigial, although it still aids in their balance, allowing the creature to race at full speed across piles of rubble and tangled scrap to close upon enemies. Isolated broods of this Tyranid creature are typified by a blue indigo coloration, and such beasts have been encountered not only across numerous space hulks, notably the Sin of Damnation, but also upon the moons of Mgal, once thought home to a tentacle-moored variation of a xenoform. Where a Genestealer is part of a larger Hive Fleet army, it will instead bear the same coloration as the rest of the Tyranids within that fleet, and such bioforms communicate via telepathy, enabling their broods to operate independently, and Hive Fleet broods are often centered around an alpha predator, sometimes mistaken as what's known as a Genestealer patriarch, though this creature is more accurately termed a brood lord, and that's the difference. One is within a hive fleet, the other is often independent. So the brood lord is not empowered by the psychic energies of a cult, but by a single brood of Genestealers, and if divorced from the greater swarm of a Tyranid invasion, hive fleet Genestealers can evolve into what is known as a pure strain form. Their life cycle is optimized to infect new hosts once new feeding grounds become viable. But the Genestealer is a completely different entity in how it operates outside of the confines of the hive fleet. It bears some similarity to the other bioform known as the Lictor in that it is an advanced infiltration unit, and it is one of the most pervasive threats facing the Imperium in M41. Physically, the Genestealer is not dissimilar to any other Tyranid, bears those same physical traits as we discussed: fast reflexes, serrated claws, and a very thick carapace of their own, able to withstand all but the heaviest of Imperial weapons. But Genestealers also have significant capacity for other higher functions, including psychic telepathy, at least on a localized scale, thereby enabling it to form what amounts to essentially a disconnected hive mind. Whereas other Tyranids, when disconnected from the hive mind, become essentially beasts driven purely by instinct and often dangerous creatures across the galaxy, speculated to belong to the Tyranid Xenos but have just been disconnected for so long they no longer form part of the hive mind or are unable to connect back with it. But for the Genestealers, they are able to create these localized hive minds known as a brood mind, and it's thought that this is necessary for them to function, as this coordinated mind is integral to how Tyranids operate by feeding information, making tactical decisions, and although this may be anthropomorphizing them slightly, it's more like instinctive driven reactive murmurations. Specifically though, how Genestealers are deployed from the hive fleet is not clear in terms of them first arriving on worlds far ahead of time. However, they have been found across the entire galaxy at this point, and often there is evidence that they were present here millennia before the Tyranid hive fleets began to at first actually assault the galaxy. It's also possible that very small scout fleets arrived in the galaxy long before humanity became aware of them, and that they were extinguished by other Xenos forces like the Eldar. As is always the case, the Imperium can only record and date events within its own scale and information, so the exact point of contact for the Tyranids in terms of the galaxy is still debatable, and whilst it's believed currently that the destruction of a Necron device caused the shockwave that alerted the bulk of Tyranids to the galaxy, this may still not be the original cause. We just don't know. Some have even speculated that the Tyranids could be a creation of the Old Ones, and that perhaps the Old Ones' webway tunnels reached out far beyond the galaxy as we know it, and that they had created other species like the Zotes far beyond the borders of known space. The most radical of speculations could even be to suggest perhaps there are old ones still out there in other galaxies around the universe. Maybe they were not all extinguished. These are but wild fantasies without a shred of evidence, of course, and I will note specifically they're very much my own wild speculations that should be given absolutely no further credence. But returning to the Genestealers, however they come to find themselves on other worlds, they will attempt to remain concealed at all costs. They will often be very few in number, and they want to hide, because they want to proliferate themselves as much as possible. Moreover, they will seek new means to transport themselves across other worlds in vessels. This could occur whilst a world is still unaware of the threat that it's facing, or when Tyranids have begun invasions and Imperials are attempting to flee, for example, the surface of a doomed prey world. We might speculate that a Genestealer aboard such a ship may carry a sphere of communication, a signature that prevents that ship from being destroyed, and so the Imperials feel that they have been luckier than they could ever imagine, when in actuality the hive mind is allowing it to pass outside the Tyranid threat with the knowledge that it carries the seeds to embed themselves below the skin of other worlds and burrow in, waiting until the time is right to burst forth and doom further planets. It has been noted that since the opening of the Great Rift, which saw the galaxy torn apart with this vast tear between real space and the immaterium, that huge numbers of Imperial refugee craft have been evacuating worlds which border the rift, and these have enabled an ideal means by which the Genestealer can spread itself across even more worlds, for it only requires a single Genestealer to reach an Imperial world for it to potentially doom this planet. This may not in fact occur for many decades, or even hundreds of years before the actual Hive fleet arrives. All the while, Genestealers will be sowing their genetic seed, and they reproduce by implanting other life forms with their own genetic material. Once this takes place, that victim will become part of the localized hive mind created by the Genestealer or the Genestealer Patriarch, and from there, that life form will become irreversibly changed. These varying generational progeny will become known as Genestealer hybrids, and initially they will appear very similar to the Genestealer. But steadily over time the corruption will breed through into creating less Genestealer-like human hybrids, but eventually the breeding will come full circle into creating what are known as pure strain Genestealers under the control of the progenitor of the cult, still the Genestealer Patriarch, a formidably intelligent alpha beast possessing fearsome, massive telepathic power. So upon a hive world, it is very much in the interest of the Genestealer to stay out of sight, and so it should not be any surprise they'll often dwell in the sewers, the caves, under hive beneath the city, and while they will prey on the populace here like folktale monsters, it is not in their interests or nature to trigger a full-blown war or conflict. This is not what they want. They will not assault vast areas of a world, or even within a hive city. Instead, they will slowly pick off victims in the darkness or turn their minions into dragging those who can be reliably turned into their midst. And so, within a very often short space of some years, a single Genestealer can establish a vast network of mind-controlled drone operatives, and in the most successful of scenarios, they may even have been able to embed their Xenos agents at every level of a local planetary government and military. Yet again, their goal is to not turn an entire world's population, nor is it to create conflict here on a world. They want to remain hidden, or at worst perhaps be a strange cult that few should really pay attention to. Some may question why the rulers of a world do not just purge this bizarre cult. Some may even decry them as heretics, and those who do will likely quietly disappear. But most will rationalise any lack of action by a hive city's leadership as indicative that such a cult is barely worthy of attention and just some crazy people. Most citizens will be content to just ignore it, continue their daily lives. It's not important. Most concerning is the fact that even now across the galaxy, those Inquisitors within the Ordo Xenos struggle to identify just how widespread the Tyranid Genestealer infestation has become or how many worlds it now affects. It is only known that there are many and that they proliferate across all the segmentums of the Imperium, essentially the entire galaxy. The one depressing fact that the Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition know is that for every Genestealer brood they successfully identify and purge, it's very likely that anything from 10 to a dozen or more are newly established or slip through the net. This is the great, troubling and unknown horror occurring across the Imperium even now, and it is for this reason that the Genestealer exists as in fact one of the most dangerous and most insidious threats to the Imperium. Some might even speculate more than the threat of chaos itself. All that is required for the cycle to be completed is when eventually a Tyranid hive fleet enters a system where Genestealer broods are present, as with the Octarius sector, and the hive mind will reconnect its synaptic dominion over the broodlord or the patriarch and its clan, and at this point the all-powerful hive mind will completely take control of the brood and its minions, and this is where things will take a dangerous turn for any Imperial world. Communications will become disrupted, planetary transports may be cancelled, defensive patrols curtailed, weapon systems sabotaged or disabled, and sabotage in general will increase across the planet or its hive cities. Critical military leaders may be found murdered, and by the time a hive fleet arrives, the planet will likely already be in a state of immense disorder. The purpose for this, of course, is that by the time Tyranid spores begin raining down upon a world and its bioforms begin their assault, the humans here will be fighting two wars, one outside their walls and one inside. And unable to mount any kind of real coordinated defense, they will crumble in very often days, if not a single day. This is the masterful approach the Tyranids have developed to ensure as always nothing more than minimizing expended biomass. The easier a world is to take, the less biomass it must spend to do so, and for little more than a single Genestealer, a tiny percentile of biomass, a Tyranid fleet can save entire planets' worth of biomass. This is the true horror of the Genestealer. Their lumbering drone-like appearance is deceptive, their true nature is insidious and all-consuming. Across the many worlds of humanity, the Genestealer threat is unfortunately not limited to only a small brood of Xenos infiltrators who seek to steadily distort a populace genetically. As we just saw, they will in fact begin to embed themselves within a society until they have a real level of control over that world and its inhabitants. After a Genestealer has arrived on a world, it will quietly and methodically begin to infect inhabitants, and from there rapidly begin to gain wider control. Humanity in many ways is a victim of its own success. Its exponential spread of colonization throughout the galaxy, coupled with its ability to adapt and manipulate its environment, has enabled it to be found across a million worlds. Yet it's this deep yearning to expand and control space, as well as its own sense of entitled ambition, has led it into dark regions where worlds are less well protected and poorly monitored. This, coupled with the scale of cities humanity now uses to colonize worlds, it means that unwelcome aliens are quite capable of penetrating the depths of a hive world and human civilization unnoticed. For the Tyranids and specifically the Genestealers, all of these factors are highly appealing and advantageous to their modus operandi. There is of course one additional factor that makes humans more appealing to the inception of a Genestealer into their populations than say the Tau, and that is of course humans' latent psychic power. While some individuals we know become identified as powerful psychers, even your ordinary human in the 41st millennium will register on the psychic scale, and this further enables the localized hive minds produced by a Genestealer broodlord and patriarch. Since the Great Rift appeared throughout the galaxy toward the end of M41, the psychic activity across humanity has reportedly increased further, leading to more unregistered but powerful psychers present across the worlds of the Imperium. And these are not safe individuals. Even for the development of a Xenos cult, there is a risk. But for their purposes, it's a risk worth taking, for should the Genestealer cult be able to produce a powerful magus, a leader who can throw out a strong and far-reaching veil of psychic control. This infecting psychic corruption is one of the more terrifying facts when it comes to the Tyranid interceptors, that although we think of them as being an apocalyptic nightmare alien species who devour entire worlds like a plague of locusts attacking a field of crops, stripping it bare before moving on, they also operate like a virus, beginning with just one small form, which can from there steadily infect countless other hive cities and ultimately destroy entire worlds, even entire systems. Genestealers, though, when first stealthily concealing themselves upon a world, will be in no immediate rush. They're playing a very subtle, extremely concealed long game. Whether alone or in a group, the first pure Genestealer to infect a human upon their new world will trigger a genetic response within them. This Genestealer will then grow to become what I've said is known as the Patriarch. This is essentially a huge and powerful Genestealer form in both size, physical strength, intelligence and psychic power. This process only occurs for Genestealers when they are cut off from the hive mind, and it's a means by which they're able to form a functioning, independent brood until they later reconnect with the main hive fleet. It will not be long before those early arrivals begin to infect other humans in the dark and hidden depths, and for those who are infected, they will begin to fester into something far more problematic. Their minds become so distorted and controlled by the Xenos genetic material inside their body, their whole perception of reality is altered, and this is when we begin to see the emergence of what are known as Genestealer cults. These cults will grow, and their bizarre outlook, which usually involves some kind of quasi-religious worship of the Tyranid form, will initially stay in the shadows still, but as their numbers grow hidden in the populace, they may become even bolder. Their ultimate goal is of course to create confusion and sabotage to destabilize or take control of Imperial worlds. Every soul in the cult is obedient to their patriarch, and just like all Tyranids will without thought sacrifice themselves for the greater good, once the cult is fully mature, it will attempt to spread further within a hive or an Imperial world, or even beyond into another planet or a nearby system. Here, pure strain Genestealers are sent out on long journeys to locate new nesting sites and begin the whole process from scratch. Typically though, a single patriarch will be enough to control a brood on a single planet, although sometimes situations can arise where there may be more than one, and strange situations can happen where they come into conflict competing for resources. This is largely irrelevant though in the grand scheme of things, because when the Tyranid fleet eventually arrive, the hive mind will override the brood mind, and the previously rival cults will all become one. The main risk for the cults in these situations is not so much the threat to each other, but that they may draw unwanted attention to themselves prior to the hive fleet arrival. Within a cult, the process of hybridization will begin fairly modestly, but then steadily explode as each generation of genetically altered hybrids will corrupt more, and this process is always delivered by the so-called Genestealers kiss, whereby an ovipositor tube, basically an organic injection tube, will pierce the skin of the target and inject them with Xenos genetic material. This will then begin steadily altering their body both physically and mentally, the main goal being to create a cult of worshippers who will become absolutely devoted to the worship of the patriarch and will allow nothing to sway their bizarre cult beliefs. In fact, the manipulation of ordinary humans in this way distorts their perception so much they effectively become unable to see truth or reality any longer. They will literally end up in this strange bubble of their own reality, believing that the Tyranid Xenos are their true calling, their savior, and they will be delivered from their hellish and most importantly, false promises made by the Imperium and the Emperor. Of course, only at the end will their reality come crashing down around them as their world is horribly consumed, and for some even then, this is not enough to break through the walls of delusion they have built for themselves, and they will fight to the very end for the Xenos even as they are torn apart and dissolved in pools of bioreclamation. The most devout cultists will be those of the earlier generations, and they will have become mutated into horrifying hybrid Xenos, wearing long flowing robes and cloaks to cover their extra limbs and swollen craniums. These first generations are often known as acolytes, and they will still appear to be very Genestealer in appearance, but will retain vestigial elements of humanity. These first generations will breed with humans to produce then a second generation of acolyte, but little change is seen between the first and second generation. In this period, the brood will also have begun capturing humans who are susceptible to the hypnotic brood mind of the Tyranid, and in doing so, they will have under their control what are known as brood brothers. Outwardly, these are human members of a local guard or PDF. In actuality, they will now be under the control of the cult. These entranced members of guard will be the genetic stock the acolytes breed with to produce the second generation, who will then do the same to produce a third, fourth, and fifth generation. The most interesting difference between the first and the second generation of cult acolytes is that the second generation can usually speak in a basic manner of low Gothic language used by the majority of Imperial citizens, whereas first generation cannot. Through each generational process, the Xenos appearance will be mildly diluted so that they appear more human in appearance. The fourth generation are usually referred to as neophytes, and they can pass as humans in everyday life, provided they still conceal any mutations and will likely remain in a low-light environment to conceal their pale or unusual complexions. However, once the brood reaches the fifth generational stage, something interesting happens. The hybrid breeding stops diluting the appearance of their progeny, and humans will be used to produce in surely what is a nightmare scenario, the birthing of pure strain Genestealers. The parents of these fifth generation creatures see them not as hideous aliens, hissing changelings that they truly are, but as soft-skinned infants, innocent, sweet. And they do everything they can to protect them, even giving their own lives if necessary. These new pure Genestealers will then be sent off on transports to infect other worlds, or perhaps across the planet to other hive cities. Through this generational process, the Genestealer cult will become ever more embedded in the society, and most importantly gain steady access to more tools, weapons and hardware. And this is all important, because by the time they're able to corrupt more critical leaders within a population, the security apparatus that would normally protect them will likely already have been compromised. Throughout the process of corruption in a human population, there is a critical difference in the Genestealer cult which makes them so efficient and also stable. For many cults will rise and fall within human hive cities very often. Many will be too stupid and outspoken and end up being crushed by the arbites or in severe situations, sororitas, PDF and inquisition. Human cults and rebellions are usually too outspoken, too eager to overthrow their authority and show their hand to be successful. They move too soon and are many times in a disorganized, uncoordinated fashion, driven more by emotion than actual planning. This makes them generally easy to be beaten down and dispersed. The leaders will be executed and so on. The one exception where this is not the case would usually be those who are guilty in worshipping the dark gods of chaos, who will be extremely difficult to detect and are likely as dangerous as the cult of the Xenos. The core difference, though, is that in human cults or rebel groups who seek to throw off the shackles of the Imperium, the Genestealer cults are firstly all connected via the Genestealer Patriarch, the Brood Mind, and this means there is never disquiet, never disagreement or dissenting opinion. They won't deal with rogue commanders wanting egotistical glory. They operate, as do the Tyranids, under a collective unifying mental veil which provides all with a mass sharing of information and a singular focus on completing their objectives whilst remaining, importantly, concealed at any cost. Unlike humans, they will not be compromised by their emotions or loyalties, and the benefit is clear to be seen with how devastating a Genestealer cult within a hive city can be. It goes beyond just mental discipline though. The Brood Mind will also imbue ordinary humans like the Brood Brothers with additional strength, speed and focus. Within the hybrids, they will be very much like the Tyranids, uncaring, cold and merciless. The cult of the Genestealer will spread voraciously through a populace, and by the time they're fully established, cults of the 4th generation, where many of the neophyte hybrids can easily pass for human, may in fact number not in the thousands or even hundreds of thousands, but within hive cities they can number in the millions. And if a world containing multiple hive cities, or should the worst scenario occur and an entire system become contaminated by the cult of the Xenos, then the numbers of followers for the Genestealer cult could number in the billions or likely even higher. Genestealer cults, once they're established on a world, can grow in other means than merely genetic manipulation or hypnotic power. Sometimes individuals are converted perhaps through initially persuasion or mere curiosity, likely in the upper levels of a hive city among a decadent nobility, always wanting to be part of that new thing. Once these aspirants of the cult have found their way down into the darkness, it will be certainly too late and their conversion assured. Soon they will bear the tattooed mark of the cult, the easily recognizable worm form that all Tyranid cults seem to bear. Sometimes they may also wear coloured armbands or pieces of jewellery, badges, etc. to help denote to others that they're indeed part of the cult and can be trusted. As I previously described, by now the Genestealer hybrid cultists will have worked their way deep into the human society, and so when the right time appears, their saboteurs will all strike together through the use of the coordinated Brood Mind. Key infrastructure and supply lines are crippled, stores of munitions destroyed, causing huge scale damage, and carefully positioned agents will simultaneously kill strategic commanders and those in positions of authority who remain uncorrupted. For the many thousands or even millions of civilians attempting to flee, they will find themselves either trapped within sectors or encountering heavy resistance from well-armed cultist militias pouring through the streets out from the depths below. The Genestealer and their cult will have planned every action to precision. The terrible Xenos intelligence will have calculated exactly the most efficient and devastating way to take control, and when they have dominion over all, the Genestealer cultists will openly begin to worship their hideous Xenos god. Flags and huge icons of banners of the Tyranid worm form will be daubed and cover buildings in the streets. The territory of humanity will become that of the alien, and now the slaughter of those who are left corralled or trapped will begin. A horrifying level of brutality against innocent civilians, all in the name of the multi-armed god, the four-armed emperor. The cultists of the Genestealer will genuinely believe to their core that the emperor of mankind is merely another imposter, like so many that were seen throughout the heresy across countless worlds, and they believe their eyes have been opened. Until now, they have been living a lie, and all that was told to them, all they thought was true deception. But now they could see clearly, finally, and they knew that this was the true path to worship. And that meant the extermination of their enemies. Many hundreds of thousands will die as the cults rampage through the civilian sectors of hive worlds, cutting them down mercilessly, or for some they might turn and allow themselves to join the cult, too fearful to give themselves to the Emperor of Man in death. For those wretched individuals, their ultimate fate will be well deserved. Meanwhile, among the more well-ordered and well-armed cult forces who have had access to military-grade weaponry, the more significant high-level threats will be ambushed, These will include the more heavily defended human bastions of Imperial Guard and PDF, giant compounds and Manufactorum filled with the materials of war. But those attacking these positions are not a ramshackle bunch of bladed cultists. These will be a mix of well-coordinated Xenos mutant hybrids who hiss and scream and tear their enemy limb from limb, and those trying to defend against this devastating assault. Some may even begin to pick out the true forms of the pure strain Genestealers. All of these backed up by the Brood Brothers and the militants who have been able to be turned, who had access to more high-level weaponry. But for the defenders, it's the sight of the pure strain Genestealer which is most terrifying, for these are the Tyranid form who have remained uncorrupted since their reception upon the world or who have been newly birthed. And for Genestealers, they did not always arrive in single numbers. Others may have arrived over the years on other transports and become connected via the brood mind to the Xenos operations taking place here. Human defenders will also begin to see other cult forms as they battle in the last stand of their world, such as the Genestealer Primus, a powerful commander, and a Magus, said to be a hypnotic psyker and telepath, and then finally they may glimpse the so-called Genestealer Patriarch itself. Should the remaining humans put up any kind of substantial fight or not is entirely unimportant. The truth is that whether or not the defences remain in position, whether their battles are a glorious victory, Pyrrhic, or even miserable defeats, it's all largely irrelevant, for the first stone cast will have sent out the devastating waves that doomed a world. The initial assault by a Genestealer cult is usually so well planned and crippling that even should the planet's defenders in the PDF Guard and Night Houses prove sufficient, the general infrastructure loss, confusion, and collateral devastation will make mounting any kind of realistic planetary defense completely futile, for the Hive Fleet has very likely already entered the system and is silently powering toward the planet even as they try to take stock of their losses. They might have the presence of mind to call for assistance, but they would only find static and dead space, for the shadow in the warp will by now have completely enveloped their world. A cult of the Xenos may appear to be terrifying and devastating, but it is merely a single link in a far more terrifying chain, one that for nearly all of humanity remains beyond comprehension: the horror, the Xenos, the great Devourer. For all the careful planning and subterfuge, the ultimate destiny for all Genestealer cults is an ending that is both tragic and apocalyptic, for they serve only one true master, the thirst for biomass, the hive mind. For the cultists, it's unclear why their distorted visions are so important, for you would assume that if the Patriarch's hold over ordinary humans was so powerful, then this would be largely unnecessary. So we must logically assume that because the cult of the Genestealer embeds this distorted reality for the humans brought under its spell, they do still hold a level of mental resistance that needs more than just the brood mind to overcome it. Or we could speculate that perhaps this is necessary in order for the Patriarch to retain control as the cult grows in numbers. It may be easy for the Patriarch to hold control over a few 100,000 minds, but once the cult grows to the millions, this may require more psychic strength than even a Xenos abomination like the Patriarch can muster. This is partly borne out by the fact that when a Tyranid fleet eventually do begin to devour a world, some cultists will appear to snap out of the grip of the brood mind and realise in their horror just what has happened, and that the situation is way beyond redemption. Others remain absolutely loyal to the cause and to the end, but it's suggestive though that the worship of starborn saviours helps to tether humans to the brood mind, and that while we know the psychic mind control is part of how a Genestealer cult operates, the worshipping aspect appears to be very much a necessary part of their cohesion and stability. Just how it came to be that this was what humans were most susceptible to is another conversation entirely. It's intriguing though that a Xenos race such as the Tyranids have managed to discover the best way to mentally control humans' loyalty to their cause is through essentially religious indoctrination. I guess we can all take from that whatever we will. I think largely though, the important point is the susceptible nature of humanity and the ease with which humans can be mentally destroyed through visions of false realities, and that once this has occurred, they will cling to it at all costs, rather than allow it to come crashing down into a cold and uncaring reality which does nothing to soothe and comfort the fears and insecurities of humans. When the Tyranid Hive Fleet finally arrives, a cult will welcome it to their world with open arms. All 4 of their arms, I should note. And they will see this glorious arrival as a fulfillment of their prophecies and rejoice ready to put into play their well-made plans. We all know by now the process of Tyranid planetary devouring, The skies cloud over, spores saturate a world's atmosphere, and before long bizarre Xenos horrors will be assaulting a world, shredding its biomatter down for processing. Where ordinary humans upon a world seeing this all play out will be in a state of absolute panic and terror, the cult will be praising and rejoicing. Their banners will be hung high, and they will be hoping to attract the attentions of one of these larger bioforms, which they see as no less than divine entities, not dissimilarly to how ordinary humans might see an Astartes or a Primarch. As the major assaults begin across a planet, the cultists will fight alongside the Xenos horrors and be filled with pride and joy in doing so. Similarly, the Tyranid hordes do not see the cultists as prey, but they may well be ignored. In this most bizarre of situations, cultist humans and nightmarish Xenos fight in a strange and peaceful alliance, a sight that for any remaining loyalist humans is both baffling and soul-destroying. In what could only be described though as the darkest of comedies, the final state for the cultists will be rejoicing at the Tyranid victory, and they will be celebrating with each other, so joyous they will now ascend to the enlightened plane of existence, the key word there being ascend. And they will continue to share this joy even as they are being torn to pieces by the Tyranid forms that now turn on them to devour them, ready for bioprocessing. As noted, during this entire process, some of the cultists may have been able to break free from the brood mind. Their goings-on around them may help the most stalwart of Imperial citizens to shake free their delusions, but this will very much be the minority and relatively insignificant at this point. Once the full-scale consumption of cultists begin, and bear in mind this can number in the millions, then there may be a true shift in the minds of the cultists. This is likely less to do with their own minds allowing them to see the truth of it all, and more likely the hive mind no longer cares to retain control over these insignificant specks of bioform that barely will register in the hive mind. And like a crashing crescendo to a harrowing aria, reality snaps back in brutal fashion for the human and later generation hybrids who now see the horror of their actions, and worse, what now awaits them. The Genestealer Patriarch offers no relief either, as its brood will now also actively attack their own offspring. Trusted advisors and minions will be torn apart, heads ripped clean from bodies in a display of brutal ferocity. Many will die choking upon their own disbelief as much as their own blood. All will be consumed now by the Tyranid phage organisms to be regurgitated into the acidic digestion pools before the raw biomass that is siphoned through capillary towers to ascend to the bioships above. In the abstract, the Genestealer cult's prophecies do come to pass, just not quite in the manner they had expected, but however they envisaged it, the hive mind does deliver on the cult's promises of ascension. The cultists do rise to a new state of being. This is not a heavenly plane of existence, they instead become the raw matter of the Tyranid fleet as one, all, and the same. For the Imperium of Mankind, the emergence of the vast Tyranid hive fleet known as Leviathan is inopportune at best, apocalyptic at worst. At the end of M41, the threats humanity faces are devastating and seemingly expanding. It faces the threat of chaos more acutely than it has for millennia, the emergence of the Necron threat is extremely disturbing, and other lesser Xenos like the Eldar and Tau continue to create problems. Thankfully, of course, our Lord and Saviour, Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium, now acutely aware of this troubling situation which has emerged during his many thousands of years in stasis. Strategic deployments of entire Ultima chapters of Primaris were deployed to specifically combat the threat of the Tyranid, as well as the power of the Imperial war machine, now directing many millions of Guard forces to the front lines in combating the Xenos horror. And much has been learned to this point in just how the Tyranids can be best defeated. And if this means some worlds may be lost in the process, it's a sacrifice that can be made without hesitation. And it begs the question, maybe Inquisitor Kryptman is not quite so insane as he appeared to be. Or perhaps it's merely more true to say that the apocalyptic problems require equally apocalyptic solutions. It should be remembered, however, that Hive Fleet Leviathan exists as only one Tyranid Hive Fleet, and many others are beginning to be detected across the galaxy. Some are very likely already active, and it makes one pose the question, what theatres of Xenos conflict are perhaps taking place that remain still undetected? The Tyranids shadowing the warp can make it difficult to detect just where they emerge, and this remains a concerning problem for the Imperium. Still, as the Octarius War discussed earlier has helped to demonstrate, the Tyranids are quite capable of having the momentum knocked out of them, becoming bogged down in grinding wars of attrition just as much as the Imperium often has found itself, and the ultimate outcome in that conflict remains extremely concerning. For the Imperium, there has been some small benefit through the emergence of the Tyranids though, most notably that they do not seem to prioritise or discriminate on which worlds and territories they attack. To that end, others such as the Eldar have been caught up in fighting their own wars against Tyranid hive fleets, which both assist the Imperium, giving it respite from other ongoing wars, and that the Tyranids have other things to deal with than just the Imperium. Indeed, the Tau Empire is said to be developing new technologies and weaponry to fight the Tyranids and field testing experimental prototypes to defend their realm. The Tau's willingness to develop new weapons at a rate far outstripping the Imperium positions itself as perhaps the best equipped to handle the threat of the Tyranid, coupled with their inert psychic state making them very difficult to exploit in terms of the Genestealer cult, unlike humanity. The only downside for the Tau is their relatively minimal presence on the wider galactic scale, and should the Imperium fall, it's unlikely they would have simply the numbers to withstand a final stage assault by the great Devourer. As a final curiosity, I wanted to note that not all Genestealer cults are doomed to be devoured by the Tyranid fleet, which might be surprising, but some planets and systems which become contaminated by the cult of the Genestealer may find themselves, through an unfortunate, in their perspective, turn of fate, overlooked by the Hive Fleet. A conflict may, for example, intercept the fleet, or they may find themselves redirected, never to return. They may simply be destroyed. So for the Genestealer cults, who have established partial or full control of an Imperial world, they remain in a bizarre state of purgatory, awaiting redemption that may never come. In some respects, they become something rarely seen, a strange Tyranid subculture, where humans remain under the control of the Patriarch, but largely have to continue existing for the time when the Hive Fleet returns, and this always remains the ultimate objective. But how or when this happens is totally unknown. Few instances are known to exist where this situation has occurred, so details on society are minimal and speculative at best. But it's very strange to imagine a human world where Tyranid symbolism and worship has become the norm, and it'd be very intriguing to see what kind of bizarre hybrid culture develops as a result over an extended period of time. Cultists of the Xenos tend to behave very much like humans for the majority of the time. They're not zombies. They seem to retain full mental capability and reasoning. They're merely directed in their subconscious and controlled by the brood mind. This is something I would love to learn more about, and hopefully at some point we will get a window into such a world where the Genestealer cult has reigned supreme for centuries, and a minimal human resistance maybe continues to fight the cause for the Imperium and the Emperor. That's my book suggestion, Black Library. We will return with a third Tyranid discussion where we get into the more detailed explorations of individual Tyranid bioforms. The Genestealer, when seen as part of a Tyranid fleet's mass infantry, is undoubtedly terrifying, but in that situation, it appears somehow as more like fodder than a corrupting destroyer of worlds. It's fascinating to see that with the Xenos species that exist in the galaxy of M41, a standard line unit can pose one of the most significant threats to the stability of the Imperium. Yet at the same time, despite the devastation even a single Genestealer can cause, we should remember the words of one Inquisitor Cryptman: they can bleed and they can die. This is why it is the duty of all Imperial citizens to remain alert at all times and report even the mere suspicion of dissent and radical factions within their neighbours and across a hive city. Failure to do so may preface the doom of us all. So now briefly I want to talk to you about Audible again, and this month's audiobook club selection features Malcador, the Sigillite in First Lord of the Imperium. And the reason I've chosen this very short story is because whilst it may be short, for anybody who has not heard of this before, it will become very clear why it is so important. I've often suggested that the Emperor in Warhammer 40,000 is not all he appears to be. I've also often suggested that just like the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor never intended for the Space Marines to last beyond the Great Crusade. And so via this small, very often overlooked tale, we'll find out some very dramatic revelations. If you're not convinced, I've recently recommended this audiobook to my Discord members, and these were their reactions. Shock said, "How is it nobody talks about this? How has there not been papers referencing this?" Bankro said, "What the hell? A few WTF moments is an understatement. Amazing audiobook though." Fabricator Mirror said, "Holy redacted." And Vurek said also, "Holy redacted, First Lord of the Imperium is mind-blowing. Why is Malcador so edgy and cool?" So given the amount of expletives, you guys might want to consider checking this out. And later this month, I'll post in my channel's community tab, and you can share your thoughts about this as per my brutal cunning vid. You can leave comments, the best of which I will feature in a follow-up video discussing First Lord of the Imperium. You can get involved today by starting your 30-day Audible trial with Premium Plus. This gives you a free audiobook as well as access to thousands of originals, audiobooks and podcasts. Additionally, you get access to the Plus catalogue, which is also filled with many thousands of audiobooks, originals and more. All included in your membership, so you can download and stream all you want for the Plus sections, no credits needed. Visit audible.com/Lutin, or for those in the US, text Lutin to 500 500. And as always, a huge thanks to all of you supporting me here on the channel. I'll see you in the next one.